the church was in need of extra funds for some emergency repairs, and asked everybody in the congregation to give from their hearts. And whoever gave the most can pick out the next 3 hymns. Well, the special offering plates, they were passed around and brought forward, and quickly the minister went through and found a check for $1,000. He looked at it and he asked Miss Rose to stand, and Miss Rose stood, and he goes, "Thank you very much for donating $1,000 to this cause. Now you get to pick out the next 3 hymns." And she looked around the congregation and said, "Hymn, hymn, and hymn." May the Lord of my words of my mouth and meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Amen. I want to take you back to a time when the world was a cold, cruel world, where the most important person was you. People were rich, or poor, or enslaved to someone else. Men owned property, men owned slaves, and men even owned their wives. The wife was expected to provide a healthy male heir. If the child was neither, then it was very commonly left by the local temples or by a town square in hopes that someone else would either take the child and care for them. Even worse, the imperfect infant or little girl would be left exposed to the elements, the cold, the rain, and the animals. Some babies were left, and it was what man could do for them than anything else. The people tended to go to the gods for what they needed at that time. If they were farmers, then they tended to go to the temples of the gods of the weather or of the land. If they were fishermen, then they would go to the gods of the sea. Even temples of the day were harsh. And even some now follow what I heard being called the temple method. If we look at the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Roman Empire, and even the Jewish temples of the day, they were all the same. They followed the temple method. And the temple method included sacred places, sacred texts, sacred men, and simply followers. Sacred texts, sacred places. These places were set aside for the gods. Followers who would come to this place, usually some sort of temple, to come and pray to the god of that temple. The local area usually had more than one temple because you usually had more than one god in that area. But they were localized. And I'll explain that in a minute. Sacred texts. Now these could be oracles, sacred texts, or even prophets. However it comes, usually these sacred texts are interpreted and told to the followers. These should be telling people how to live their lives and what their gods expected of them. The sacred men. Sometimes they were sacred women, but usually, more than not, they were sacred men. And these men were the ones that interpreted the sacred writings. Most people then could not read, and it was up to these sacred men to tell their flocks how they should live their lives based on what the texts were telling them. And simply followers. These are the people that come and listen to the sacred men and find out what their gods wanted of them. These followers would bring tribute to the temples, which the sacred men usually took care of by either eating or spending. Then one day came along a man into this cruel world, put a whole new spin on life. A new look at the gods, a new look at the people. Jesus came and brought something brand new to the world. He didn't come to say, forget everything that you learned. Forget the laws. Forget the prophets. No, in Matthew 5 says to the community, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Remember, God with Abraham had set the people aside for something special. Jesus comes and says that you have been set aside for something special, and that it has come to pass. And what the prophets and their writings say has now happened. It's time now to go forward with something brand new. It's what we call the Jesus method. And the Jesus method has the new covenant, the new commandment, the new ethic. It's a brand new movement. Under the new covenant, Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and he says to them that the old covenant was used to remember how God the Father freed them from slavery, from the hands of the Egyptians, by placing the blood of the lamb over the doorposts, and death would pass them by. Jesus tells them that he is the new covenant, This wasn't easy for them to accept or even to understand. After all, it's been a long time of celebrating. Now to have Jesus say, hey, I'm changing it, was very hard for them. But what they didn't understand then was that the first covenant was the freedom from bondage, and it would be changed to the freedom from sin. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when they had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to the disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. New commandment. Jesus gave us a new commandment in the Jesus method. A Jewish person of the day had the 10 commandments plus the 600 laws on top of it to remember. Jesus now comes along and says, instead of all of those, remember 2 laws of love. Remember that Jesus did not come to abolish the law, and he doesn't. Instead, he gives us this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And this doesn't abolish the 10 commandments from the Old Testament. What it does is it brings in, thou shalt not have other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images. Thou shalt not take the name of thy Lord of thy God in vain. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He also added this. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now remember, your neighbor is everyone but you. And that takes care of the rest of the 10 commandments. Honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And thou shalt not covet. On top of all this, the Jesus method included a new ethic. The old ethic was, how does it make me better off? But Jesus told his followers that there is a new ethic. Everything will now be looked at through a very special word. Everything that happens to them or they see happen needs to be judged by the word love. Any new law that comes down should go through this filter. How does this impact our love for God and our love for our neighbor? The new movement. Jesus said that the old ways were the old ways, and they have come to an end. Whereas the temple method was territorial. After all, you usually didn't find the Greek gods hiding out in Egypt. But Jesus says that his method, the Jesus method, was to be worldwide. Jesus says to them that there is only one God, and he is for everyone. And in Mark 16, Jesus says to his disciples, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. The disciples had real issues going out into the real world. Their world was the Jewish world, which was Jerusalem and Judea. And this is where they lived. At first, they weren't going out very far from it, but they were creating pockets of Jesus followers. They told people that they knew Jesus, which was different from that fateful night. But now they're going out, they're telling people they knew Jesus. They told people how he healed the sick, helped the blind. The deaf could hear, and the dead would live. And Jesus was crucified by the Romans, egged on by the Jewish people. And 3 days later, he was walking around as he said he would be doing. Now, this is not in the Bible, but I could see this conversation taking place, so maybe it's in the Lost Scroll somewhere. But it takes place up in the balcony of heaven. God's looking over and he calls Jesus to his side. Go, son, come here. Now, I see that your disciples are doing pretty good around there, Jerusalem, Judea. They're not really spreading out like you told them to. Well, Father, I know we're working on it. We're working on it. But, we need to find somebody who's willing to go into those old boats. We're looking for somebody like him. Yeah, that person there. Look. See how he's very forceful? He's not going to be stopped what he's doing. You need to convert him. Dad. No. Yeah, bring him onto our team. But Dad, that's Saul. See, Saul of Tarsus, which is a city in modern-day Turkey, had a type A personality, raised in the Jewish faith, and believed that Jesus followers needed to be put down. If you're a Jesus follower, watch out for Saul until Acts 9. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what to do." So he was blinded with that meeting. When the time came for him to see again, well, you can read that in Acts. But he realized he was doing wrong in his search and destruction of the Jesus followers, and he became one. Paul was given sight into both, that he could physically now see and what Jesus was doing. Saul changed from the great Christian hunter to the great Christian missionary. Paul went outside of that Jewish world and started more Christian groups than anyone else. Paul was teaching the new method for the Jesus followers, for the Christians. And one day he heard about how some of the Jewish missionaries had gone into Galatia, also in Turkey, where they left a group of Christians. And these Jewish missionaries started to add back the temple method to the new way of life. It's saying that since Jesus was Jewish, you should be Jewish, not come to make you follow the old ways of the temple method. And if you want to follow the temple method, then follow it wholly. Follow it completely. But Jesus came to give you a new way, a new life, the Jesus method. It didn't matter if you were Jewish or Gentile. You were a Jesus follower. And as a Jesus follower, the only thing that matters is you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says to love God with your all and love your neighbor as yourself. Paul says that we should be serving one another humbly in love. So with Jesus followers, the main word here is love. So here is the question we need to ask ourselves. What does love require of me? Back in that first century, everyone was surprised with the Jesus followers because these people were filled with love. It was Jesus who started to change the cruel, hard world to a place where love can live. He was healing, feeding, giving life, and the Jesus followers were following in his footsteps. Yes, the non-Jesus followers still put their girls and non-perfect boys out, but it was the Jesus followers who asked that question. What does love require of me? And answered that by taking them in and raising them as their own. The homeless were being taken in by the families that could barely feed themselves, but who asked the question, what does love require of us? The feelings by the non-Jewish followers or the non-Jesus followers wouldn't want to be one, but I'm glad they're around. And yes, some converted from their gods to the Christian God. When it came to relationships, what does love require of me? With the Jesus method, wives moved up from the status of being property to being in a partnership. Even as a leader, what does love require for me? If we look at Jesus, he became a servant to his disciples, and he washed their feet. Jesus took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist.